Welcome to A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. From Eden to eternity, the Bible tells one big story of redemption. My name is Tiffany, and I want to spend a few minutes with you every day walking through the Bible chronologically. Together, we will explore God's sovereign plan as the events of Scripture unfold and point to Jesus. Hey, Year in the Bible friends, Tiffany here. Welcome back. Today, we take a look at 1 Samuel chapters 12 through 14. It can be easy for us to get lost in a lot of the military maneuvers and military language. But there are truths to be found in these chapters to point us to our perfect King Jesus and to remind us of the importance of our heart's posture toward the Lord. In chapter 12, Samuel gives his final speech to the nation of Israel. This speech signifies his stepping aside as a judge and acknowledging the monarchy's role in ruling over the nation. But Samuel remains a prophet of God and will continue to minister to the people and Saul as he shares the word of the Lord. In the first part of the speech, Samuel asks the nation questions to signify that he has been a blameless judge before them. He then gives a brief recounting of the nation's history, specifically the events of the Exodus and God's raising up of the judges to bring deliverance from their enemies. The people had now chosen to have an earthly king govern them, but that did not negate the fact that God was their king. They were still called to follow his statutes and ordinances, and if they didn't, the blessings and curses mentioned in Leviticus and Deuteronomy still applied. But this time, Samuel specifies that those blessings and curses will affect the people and the king. No king was above following God's law. The sign that Samuel prays for from the Lord reminds the people who their true king has always been. Though they may have an earthly king ruling over them, God is the one who controls even the thunder and the rain. The people's response was fear, but Samuel tells them not to turn away from the Lord. So often, when we realize we've sinned, our response is to try and hide from the Lord, like Adam and Eve did in the garden. Shame tells us to run away, but we should instead draw near to the Lord in worship. As Samuel says in chapter 12, verse 22, we draw near because the Lord will not abandon his people, because of his great name, and because he has determined to make you his own people. God determined to make us his own through his plan of redemption. We draw near to him because of forgiveness, salvation, and reconciliation through Jesus Christ. And as his people, we do as Samuel says in verse 24. Above all, fear the Lord and worship him faithfully with all your heart. Consider the great things he has done for you. Samuel's words from the Lord have lasting effects even today. We spent a lot of time on chapter 12 today, but chapter 12 clearly explains how Israel and King Saul were to live before the Lord. And as we will see in chapters 13 and 14, Saul makes many poor decisions, and his heart isn't devoted to worship of God, but focused on himself. At the end of chapter 14, we read what many Bible headers call a summary of Saul's kingship. The best word to summarize his kingship is conflict. Conflict seemed to follow Saul wherever he went. This was a direct result of not following God's leadership. Saul's first mistake came in chapter 13 when he went to battle the Philistines and did not wait for Samuel. In his haste, he offered the burnt offering to the Lord. This was foolish for many reasons. First, Saul lacked patience. Second, we know from Numbers 18 that only the priests were to bring offerings before the Lord. What Saul did was prohibited. And third, Saul was using the presence of the Lord like a good luck charm. God was the one who brought victory, not Saul. Saul didn't listen to the Lord or his appointed messenger, Samuel. Because of this, God removed the kingship from Saul's line, and Samuel tells Saul that a man after God's heart had been found to replace him. Sadly, Saul seemingly has no reaction to this news and goes back to business as usual. But the hand of the Philistines was great in the land, and they alone held control of the metal that made weapons. Israel was made weak. Only Saul and Jonathan, his son, had weapons. As we study chapter 14, we quickly see the difference in approach between Jonathan and Saul. Though it was just Jonathan and his armor-bearer, Jonathan trusted that God would give him the victory. God used Jonathan's initiative and courage against the Philistines. Even though Jonathan was heavily outnumbered, it was God who planted terror and confusion in the hearts of the Philistines and allowed Jonathan to defeat so many. Saul could have taken advantage of this terror and confusion and led the rest of the Israelites directly into battle, but he delayed. Instead, he chose to have a roll call. He also called for the ark, which wasn't necessary because God's presence was already there, ready to bring the victory to Israel. Despite Saul's delay, God saved Israel that day. But Saul's rash decisions continued and compounded. As the battle moved elsewhere, Saul told his troops they weren't allowed to eat before evening, and if anyone did, they were cursed. This was poor leadership by Saul. He placed his need for vengeance over his army's physical needs. The men then sinned themselves by killing animals and eating them with the blood still inside the animal. We know this was prohibited because we studied it back in Leviticus 17 and Deuteronomy 12. Upon seeing this, Saul suddenly worries about his men's sin and wants to follow the Lord's commands by draining the blood. Saul is a great example of man picking and choosing what we want to follow, especially when making our own moral code. We must beware of this tendency and remember that true blessing comes from a heart that is completely devoted to the Lord. Saul's rash oath concerning the men not eating is further compounded by the fact that Jonathan ate in ignorance and was revived by the honey he ate. Sadly, Saul was willing to put his own son to death after the lots were cast and Jonathan was found to be the guilty one. Saul's oath wasn't necessary, and showing mercy and grace toward his son would have endeared him more to his nation than acting with a strong arm. The army loved and respected Jonathan, and it was their call to save him that stayed Saul's hand. Chapters 13 and 14 display just how different Saul and his son Jonathan were. Saul did not make decisions based on God's statutes and ordinances, whereas Jonathan trusted God's sovereignty and acted with leadership and courage. Saul failed, while Jonathan showed faith and reliance on the Lord. This same pattern will be seen as we move forward and see the difference in Saul and David, and see God's blessings fall on the man after his own heart. Thanks for joining me today. Tomorrow, we take a look at 1 Samuel chapters 15 through 17. Bye, friends!